when Tony and I talked about the potential of becoming, he said one of the things that First Baptist was able to do was to disagree agreeably. And so anytime we're seeking discernment, anytime we have questions, one of the things that I've been blessed by is usually if I have said something in a prayer or from the pulpit that one of our church members is frustrated by, I get to share coffee or a meal. And I'm blessed by it. I would rather that than be blasted on Facebook for all to see. Because we live in a relationship with one another, right? And I feel responsible for what I say and want to walk alongside you in all the things that I preach about and teach about. And so that's the air in which we walk into our space this morning as we talk. And some of the things that we've talked about, one of the ways that I've prepared is in talking with several of you and in knowing CBF as well as I do, having really only ever served churches that were affiliated with CBF, I've prepared some questions ahead of time, like I said, to help us go ahead and begin to think about how we partner. So the first question I'm going to have Paul come and answer is how large the CBF community is, and our folks, many of our folks know what First Baptist Greenwood looks like and feels like, but how might we compare? Where do we fall on that CBF continuum of all those partner churches?
Well, first, let me thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation in this way. And my desire is, just as your pastor has said, he exists in relationship with you all every week over a long season. And so I pastored for a long time, and John, you're not the only pastor who's ever said something that caused a church member to have a question. In fact, if that never happens, I would wonder if you're actually in a Baptist church. And so I want you to know that it's important to me. CBF is, above all else, intentionally chose to describe ourselves as a fellowship and not as a denomination or a convention. And that was at the assistance of lay people, by the way. That was not a preacher decision. Lay people led that decision 35 years ago. And so we've always tried to lean into being a relational community, which means you should be able to ask your questions and we should exist in relationship. It also means, because we're Baptists, that the local congregation under the leadership of the Holy Spirit is the highest authority. The denomination is not the highest authority. If you're really Baptist, you understand that the highest authority is Jesus Christ, and the next highest authority is a congregation of believers gathered under the lordship of Jesus Christ, guided by the Holy Spirit. And then those congregations, from time to time, forge other relationships. So that's the understanding I bring to this conversation. I want you to ask whatever you want and need to ask, and I want to steward that as well as I can. So, Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, celebrating our 35th birthday. Today is more than 1,400 congregations, primarily in the southeastern United States, but less so than once before. So we have So in the last year and a half, I preached as far west as Phoenix, Arizona, and as far northeast as New London, Connecticut, and as far southeast as San Juan, Puerto Rico. So CBF has congregations that far spread. While we are still majority white congregations, we have a growing number of congregations that are predominantly Black or Spanish speaking. That is an area in which we are growing. Of our congregations, I would say that the overwhelming majority are not unlike what I was trying to describe in the sermon this morning. People who do not agree on all things. So in the overwhelming majority of our congregations, the way I like to describe it is, in the last election, there are members of our congregations who voted every way imaginable with every imaginable attitude about their vote. Which means that in the majority of our congregations, those congregations are some of the last places in their communities where people who do not think the same way about everything or vote the same way in every election are still coming together to try to get something good done. Which means we are really unique in the American religious landscape. When I was hired for this job just over 8 years ago now, someone said to me, I don't think you CBF people understand how unique your congregations are in their big tent purple quality. Do we have a few congregations that are overwhelmingly really liberal? Yes. Do we have a few congregations that are overwhelmingly incredibly conservative? Yes. Are most of our congregations somewhere in the middle? Yes. So, most of the congregations I visit to preach would fit the description I just gave you. So that's 1,400 congregations. CBF today is also the ministries of 31 career field personnel. Those are missions personnel who serve not only in the United States, but in Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. CBF has, in our history, endorsed more than 1,200 chaplains and pastoral counselors. Over 950 are actively serving. And they embody the love of Jesus in places like Pastor John and I can never go. In really unique, specialized settings. So the CBF community is those 1,400 congregations, but it's also those field ministries, it's those chaplains and pastoral counselors, it's 15 state and regional organizations. First Baptist Greenwood has been a leading member, not just of CBF globally, but of CBF of South Carolina. So you are an active part of one of those state and regional organizations. Lane used to work for that organization, as you well know. So that's some about the reach and the composition of CBF. The way I think, so the two churches I pastored full time were also both very purple, very big tent churches. And the way I describe leading CBF is like doing that, but instead of having a congregation that has 700 active members or 500 active members or whatever who come from a wide range of ways of thinking and feeling and acting, I just deal with 1,400 congregations that come from a pretty wide range of experiences and perspectives. So that's a little bit about our reach.
One of the ways we see ourselves as partners is in mission. You
Yes.
just said that out loud, that y'all are at work in places where we can't go. That's one of the reasons, that's one of the ways I describe our relationship with CBF. While we've done kind of the 6-week Baptist journey through Forefront of Freedom. Can you talk a little bit more about what's unique about mission and the ministries that CBF both provides support and direction for, and then what makes it unique, what makes maybe even global missions a unique connection?
So one thing that makes CBF global missions increasingly unique is that we're still supporting career missions field personnel. So when you, like if you've been Baptist longer than me, you think I just made an absurd statement. It may not be the last time today you think I make an absurd statement, so chalk it up. But it used to be that it was common for denominations to support through offerings, through denominational budgets, what we once called career missionaries. That is actually now exceptionally rare. So most people who are sent in the world today as missionaries or as field personnel have to raise not just their program budget costs through active fundraising, but also their salaries and their benefits. If you think that's easy, ask St. Paul. Because Sunday school lesson after lunch, Paul wrote Romans and Philippians as mission fundraising letters. It's just a fact. And it's really hard to raise money to pay your own salary in addition to all other work you feel called to do. Well, the 31 global missions field personnel who our fellowship still supports, we fully support. That is, through the offering for global missions, our fellowship receives funds from congregations that allow those 31 people to serve full-time in a mission setting. And that is more and more unique. A parallel uniqueness is many of them have served for a very long time. So I doubt many of you were able to be in St. Louis last summer for our General Assembly, but I got to stand on the stage of that meeting next to our longest serving field personnel couple. They have been in Thailand for 30 years. 30 years. And they're my age. So they could serve 8 or 10 more. And their ministry, this is Susie and Kurt person. You can read all about them on CBF's website, but their ministry illustrates the unique power of long-term presence. 30 years is a long time to be in a place like Thailand. And they spent most of those years in northern Thailand in a small village inhabited by Bisu people. So Kurt is trained as a linguist. And he was sent by CBF alongside Wycliffe Bible translators 30 years ago to go live among Bisu people who didn't think they had a language because they couldn't write it down. So Kirk, talk about not taking the easy way. You know what Kirk did? He helped the Bisu people learn to write their own language. He didn't write it for them. He helped them learn to write their own language so that 20 years into their ministry, Kirk and his wife Susie stood on the stage of our General Assembly in Greensboro, North Carolina, and held up a Bisu translation of the New Testament. Well, last March, this time last year, I was in Thailand to meet with all of CBF's global missions personnel who serve in Asia. And they took me to the Bisu village, and I got to meet the lead translator, a Bisu man, who when he dubbed the translation was not a Christian. Translated the entire New Testament, still not a Christian. And then one day he had an experience, he was overcome with Christ's love and chose to give his life to Jesus. So I had been in the room in Greensboro where Susie and Kirk held up the Bisu New Testament, but I got to have dinner with leaders of a Bisu church and listen to them sing songs written in their worship culture and in their own language. So people are coming to Christ because of the witness of Bisu Christians who could not have ever heard the story of Jesus if someone had not taught them how to write their own language. Y'all, that's not a 3-week short-term mission trip. That takes churches like First Baptist Greenwood supporting the offering for global missions year in and year out, in season and out of season, and their lives being changed on the other side of the world that you cannot see, but who would not have been changed without you. That's one story of 31. You all are in relationship, you all are an encourager church for Janae Angel. That is to say, you all, aside from your offering for global missions contributions, you support Janae's ministry in Belgium. Her ministry is focused on introducing Jesus to Muslim immigrants who left Syria because of the conflict there and who are now in Belgium. And it's not an easy context in which to do ministry, but there are people coming to Christ all the time in that ministry. And your partnership, above and beyond your support for the offering for global missions, makes that possible. She's been there well more than a decade. In fact, I think our shortest serving field personnel unit right now has served where they are about 8 years. But many, 20, 25, 30 years. So the fact that we're still doing career missions, the fact that it's long-term, the fact that we're cultivating those kind of congregational connections you have with Janae, And last but not least, the last thing I'll say, then we'll move on to whatever your next question is that, for all the years I've been doing this job, I probably said this to some of y'all a couple of years ago, everywhere I go, somebody says, so tell me, Paul, in CBF, do you all believe in inviting people to follow Jesus, or do you believe in taking care of human need? Yes. Yes. Because it turns out that the Jesus who we invite people to follow spent all of his time taking care of human need. And we cannot be inviting people to follow Jesus if we're not involved in living Jesus' life in the world. And so we live Jesus' life in the world, feeding the hungry, providing medical care for those who are sick, helping people experiencing other kinds of personal crisis. And in the midst, we are living Jesus' life and we are inviting people to follow Jesus. So it is not either or. And I would respectfully submit that anything that is either or is just this or just that is probably not big enough to be the gospel. So that more holistic understanding of mission also sets us apart from some denominations who are only interested in social action. And that you can do a lot of good that way. Or others who have a very narrow view of evangelism as a limited venture involving a person's soul. But we think the gospel that is unleashed at the Great Commission and with the Great Commandment necessarily involves both. So that's some of our global mission uniqueness.
We've talked about global missions. We've talked about sharing the gospel. I think one of the ways that a mentor of mine described it is, what I think you more eloquently said it, but what you've been describing is the sense that of what makes CBF and First Baptist believers different than Rotary.
Yes.
Because Rotary is great.
Wonderful. I was a member of a Rotary Club in Athens. Yes.
Yes, and I'm a member of Greenwood Rotary here. But the difference is the name of Christ.
That's right.
Is
That's
what
right.
we drive with us.
Absolutely.
All right, we've talked about missions well and good. As a congregation who gives, as consumers in America, we're always looking for a good deal. Right? We want to stretch our dollar. Anytime I remember, oh gosh, do y'all remember the the $4 deal at 4 for 4 at Wendy's? Do you realize the 4 for 4 at Wendy's is now $6? Times are changing. So, I could get that 4 for 4, did it often on youth minister's budget.
Yep.
We're looking at ways in which our dollar can be maximized. So, what do congregations get what do we get for our dollar? Outside, we understand you love Jesus and you tell the world about Jesus. But what about local congregations? What about the ways in which you all do support the ministry to local congregations?
So I really appreciate the question because it gives me a chance to say that I don't think there's anything wrong with trying to be the best possible stewards of a congregation's financial and human resources. And there was a time when someone who represented a denomination would say, well, you should just support the denomination because. You know how bad a Baptist statement that is? Like, whatever you want to do with this conversation, hear me clearly. I think you're really wise. CBF, our economics are changing. Congregational economics are changing. We are all accountable to Jesus for the way we use the resources Jesus has entrusted us. Which means a denominational leader who works for congregations can't just show up and say, well, you should support us because, and you shouldn't just say, you should support us because you always supported us. You know what that's called? That's called taking people for granted, and that's not a very holy thing. So CBF takes very seriously the idea that we exist to serve and strengthen congregations, and that we are supposed to use our resources to serve congregations, including but not limited to connecting them to Jesus' mission around the world. So right before the pandemic, CBF was in the middle of a really thorough strategic planning process. And it was unprecedented in our denomination because we didn't just listen to preachers. Frankly, we tried to listen to as many lay people in as many congregations as possible. And we heard from more than 760 congregations. 80% of the responses to a survey were lay people. And what we learned in that survey has helped us target our resources to try to serve congregations in ways that responded to the needs that came out of that. So one need that came out of that was our congregation said overwhelmingly, and this includes the most conservative and the most liberal and every shade of purple in between. You know what the congregation said to us was their biggest challenge? What we called financial strain. Elements of financial strain are there is deferred maintenance on the building. Evidence of financial strain are that giving patterns are changing as gathering patterns are changing. Evidence of financial strain is benefits for staff cost more than they used to, just like the Wendy's value meal. And dollars don't go as far. And what we discovered was nobody inside our space or outside, even among our partners who do church consulting work, nobody is working with congregations around their financial needs. Nobody. And so we stood up a body of work, which is our fastest growing body of work that we do for no additional fee for CBF partner congregations to help them assess their current financial environment and then offer them different opportunities by which they can assess their next faithful step in response to what they learn. So there's an initial assessment that is done by members of our staff with not just the pastor, but pastor and lay leaders in the congregation. And then there are several different follow-up opportunities we offer congregations based on what is learned in that engagement. That has, in the last 4 years, that body of work has grown astronomically, and it's served a really wide range of our congregations. It's starting to make a difference, and we can see it, and we're grateful. Another place we try to serve congregations is by helping congregations that feel so led have a discernment process about how they believe Jesus is calling them most specifically now. That ministry is called Dawnings. It's existed in CBF for more than 10 years. Right now, it's being used more widely than it's ever done. And it's a series of prayer practices and experiences and conversations that congregations have to discern their next step in their mission and their ministry and their calling in their communities. That has also been offered at no additional fee to CBF partner congregations for more than a decade, and the testimonies I hear as I travel are really substantial. Somewhere else that we are actively involved in trying to serve congregations is in leadership. And we're doing that in several ways. So CBF from our founding has been trying to pay attention to helping new generations of women and men discover calls to the gospel ministry. Sometimes you'll hear people who have my kind of job tell you there's a crisis of calling. I think that's poorly said. God is always calling. There is an absence of listening and an absence of all of us doing our part alongside with God to notice, name, and nurture those whom God is calling. But, something else that's shifting other than the cost of food at Wendy's and McDonald's is the number of candidates available when churches look for pastors. And that's even more pronounced a challenge when churches look for youth ministers, children's ministers, and the like. When I was young, people used to call me young. No mas. But when I was young, churches would often have 50 or 100 applicants for open ministerial positions. That's not true anymore because we have not identified as many people as we should who God is calling. And so right now, historically, CBF has tried to provide resources to congregations to help them notice and name those who are being called. And we've tried to partner with seminaries to better prepare those whom God is calling to be pastors. There are a lot of churches today who are being served by pastors whose theological education was partly paid for by scholarships funded by CBF congregations. What we're trying to do right now is to make sure that if we are partnering with a seminary to provide scholarship funds, that they are using the funds in ways that actually prepare people to lead churches. Because here's a news flash for you. Being a specialist in ancient Near Eastern languages is not a preparation to lead anything, except a Ugaritic class. Do y'all teach Ugaritic here at First Baptist Greenwood? No, but you sure do. Well, you do. Praise God, I finally met somebody. We'll talk after the fact. But but what we do need is people who know how to lead in the midst of relentless change, and who know how to be community as well as congregational leaders, and who know how to hold space for difference. Because you know what? That course isn't being taught hardly anywhere right now either. So we're trying to think both about how we support existing congregational leadership teams and also how we call new generations of people, not just to the mission field, but to congregational ministry. So a question, just as your congregation every day, John, is asking the question, how do we make the best use of the resources we have? At CBF, we're asking similar questions. How can we take the resources given by congregations for things that are not related to the global mission and use those in ways that benefit congregations? So we actually have, if we all talk again in 6 to 12 months, there are several new things getting ready to roll out that will build more on what I've already shared. But that's an example of how we think about
Um, You've already described us well in that we're a big tent, we're a purple church.
Mm-hmm.
Use that language in the search committee, and they're like, purple, what do you mean? And I just
Paladins? Probably not. No.
No paladins. But there have been some news articles, news breaking related to CBF and some decisions that you all made, which has elated some people in the CBF life, and who are members of congregations like ours, who have been frustrated.
Yes.
And so the two issues that I have had conversations with members about have been, the first was the choice to join the lawsuit against the Department of Homeland Security. Could you talk about the decisions, why, and what that was about?
Absolutely, and I appreciate the question. So yes, just over a year ago, the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship became a plaintiff in a lawsuit against the Department of Homeland Security. And several things guided our decision to do that. One thing that guided our decision to do that, though, you'll be surprised to know where this started, probably. This started in phone calls we were getting from pastors of very purple churches, whose churches were running, because of their location, English as second language classes, or who had ministries like food pantries or feeding ministries operating out of their congregations, or who were partners with some of our field personnel whose primary work was actually given toward helping people who were in the country legally navigate the immigration system. When the Department of Homeland Security changed its guidance, so for 30 years until last January, under Republican and Democratic presidents, the Department of Homeland Security had a guidance document that said that the Department of Homeland Security could not do immigration law enforcement without a warrant on a church property. It was called the sensitive locations protections. In fact, those protections existed again under Republican and Democratic presidents, and they affected not just houses of worship, but also hospitals and schools. The lawsuit that CBF joined has an extraordinarily narrow focus. The focus is to ask to seek legal relief that would require the Department of Homeland Security to return sensitive location status to houses of worship. We did it because pastors in our community reporting to us, for example, we have people we baptized in the last 6 months who don't now feel safe to come to church. People are not coming to be fed because they're afraid of what will happen. Attendance at our ESL programs has been cut in half. And the overwhelming number of people who were not showing up were in the country legally. So the documents in the lawsuit that was filed made clear that we were not representing that CBF Baptists all think the same way about all matters related to immigration policy. Come on. In fact, in my own deposition, I said the congregations for whom I work have a wide range of convictions and opinions about immigration policy. True statement. Probably true here. Definitely true in a lot of the other places I interact with. But we believe that congregations, as Baptists who believe in church freedom, we believe that congregations have to be free to live out the ministry of Jesus in their own community. And we were having pastors of congregations from all over, and mainly purple center-right congregations, say, we are experiencing significant challenges because of this change that was made. So the lawsuit seeks a restoration of sensitive status for houses of worship around immigration. It would not preclude, it is legal today, and it was legal 2 years ago. If a law enforcement officer shows up at that door with a warrant, they are free to carry out an action. The lawsuit does not seek to stop that. What it seeks to do is to take the enforcement back to the state of play before a year and a half ago, as it existed in the administrations of Republicans and Democrats alike for 35 years. I'll give you a status update on where the lawsuit is, and there's some other confusion about that too, because this is one of 3 lawsuits. And if you have friends that are United Methodist or PCUSA or Lutheran or several other kinds of Baptists, their denominations are also involved in similar kinds of lawsuits. The difference is 2 of the lawsuits now have what's called the temporary injunction, which means the lawsuit we're in and one that was filed in another jurisdiction not long ago, the plaintiffs are now covered by what's called the temporary injunction, which means that any CBF partner congregation is actually a protected location now when it comes to law enforcement matters. The largest of the lawsuits did not gain a temporary injunction. And so when it didn't get their injunction, we fielded another round of questions. So we got in the lawsuit because of questions we were being asked by church leaders. We got in the lawsuit making it very clear that we didn't think we could represent that all of our congregations thought the same way about immigration. That we said on the record, they do not. We got into the lawsuit to seek to restore a balance that had existed for more than 30 decades in Democratic and Republican administrations. And I'll tell you, you all are probably aware that the Department of Homeland Security is currently shut down. And there's a lot of negotiation going on about getting it reopened. And a possibility for which there is Republican and Democratic support is to pass a law that for the first time in 30 years would grant this sensitive locations protection, not just for houses of worship, but once again for hospitals and schools. So the focus is that narrow that there are Republican members of Congress who have interest in that as a way of getting beyond the current impasse. So that's why we did it. I always like to make sure there's clarity around the really narrow focus, because part of the information that's out there is that we're trying to, like this is about widespread comprehensive immigration policy. It is not. It is about pressing a reset button on a very narrow aspect that protects the freedom of churches to live out the Baptist distinctive of soul liberty. And the 4 fragile freedoms you were talking about are referenced in the action. The point of law, I think there's some lawyers in the room, so when I'm quoting the Bible, I feel pretty safe. When I'm quoting points of law, I feel like I'm getting a little risky. So the point of law actually is appealing to court actions in the last 10 years that have focused not just on the religious liberty of individuals, but also the religious liberty of institutions, including churches, to live out their religious liberty absent some compelling public interest. So that's why you can't force a church to do an LGBTQ marriage, even though it's legal. And that's why businesses don't have to provide services around those kinds of marriages, because of a religious liberty argument that was made. And that's the same point of law that's being cited in our lawsuit that allows churches to be able to carry out their ministry without becoming a staging ground for a law enforcement operation, unless there's a warrant. If there's a warrant, by all means.
Thank you. Are there follow-ups to that?
Kenny? Let's make sure you have a microphone so that the good folks who are going to join us after the fact can hear you.
Dr. Baxley, thank you so much for coming. I had a conversation.
We did.
Late last year about this, and this lawsuit is one of the things that I obviously wanted to hear about.
Absolutely.
If I sound confrontational, I don't mean to be, but this is important to me and others in this room. I think that this seems like Vixen politics with religion, and I don't understand the necessity of our organization being part of a lawsuit like this, regardless of what your political leanings are. And some of the activities of CBF, we don't hear about in this church. We don't go to the CBF meetings. Our staff goes. I guess a few people might go. Not blaming the staff or anything. This is just historical, the way things have worked.
Sure.
And this lawsuit, I don't think anybody in this room knew about this lawsuit unless I had told them that I saw this on the internet, or you told them today. And that's shame on us. We need to find a better way to handle these things. But I just don't see the necessity of CBF, who we are identified with, in getting into the political realm of what's going on in America. Right or wrong, somebody's dealing with that. I don't choose to be a part of it. And that's maybe I'm a chicken, I don't know. But, we don't see it here in Greenwood like maybe you even see it in Atlanta. I don't know. But, so that's just a comment, I guess. And I don't know how anybody else feels, but I don't think we ought to be in politics.
So, continue.
And the other thing is, I feel like since whatever 1991, when we went this route and ended up with CBF, that I don't think we're as liberal. Now, I may be wrong, but I don't think we're as liberal as a lot of the churches that identify as CBF. And really, I'm not sure I had any idea as to the liberalness of some of the CBF activities until Tony left here. And we started doing a sort of a reevaluation of our church. And Tony went to First Baptist Greenville, which is, I always thought was like our church, but it's really not.
No.
It's a lot different from this church.
It is.
But anyway, I didn't come to make a speech. But thank you.
Well, you've had to listen to me talk a lot today, so I'm glad to hear you speak about your concerns. And first of all, Kenny, you've just done this church and this conversation a tremendous service. You know, Kenny acknowledges we did have a conversation late last year, and I think Kenny and I may not agree on all things, but we agreed this should be an open conversation where different perspectives could be shared, and that's what you have done. And so, sincerely and genuinely, thank you for one thing. So I don't take, you said you didn't want to come across as confrontational. I don't experience anything you just said as confrontational. You were a Baptist giving your testimony. Well, my wife says the same thing about me, Kenny, so we may not agree on all things today, but maybe we should get together and talk at some point about these things. So you made a really helpful, there are two things really you said that I want to say, but if you want to hear me respond to more, please say so. First Baptist Greenwood is a lot more like most of the churches I visit than is First Baptist Greenville. I love First Baptist Greenwood, and I actually love First Baptist Greenville, although, you know, there are certainly points that make those churches alike and different. But one of the things that's happened in our larger media world is that, and this is actually not as true about First Baptist Greenville as it is some other churches, a few of CBF's most progressive partner congregations are platformed both in religiously progressive media and religiously conservative media as a representation of who CBF is. First Baptist Greenville is absolutely part of CBF. But there are way more congregations in CBF that are much more like First Baptist Greenwood than First Baptist Greenville in terms of how they would define themselves. So I would want you to know that you are not alone in the CBF world, and you're not even, First Baptist Greenwood is not a minority experience in the CBF world. And that's a really, really important point. This is probably a point where you and I are going to simultaneously agree and see things absolutely differently. And that means we're really having a Baptist meeting. What I mean by that is I actually don't see what CBF did in the lawsuit as a political act. I see what CBF did in the lawsuit as a response to advocate for the religious liberty of congregations who are way more politically diverse and yet getting way more done in the world than are most of the partisan political forces in our world. And if it weren't for the fact that the provision we were seeking restored has been something that's been held to by people who are otherwise very different politically, we wouldn't be in the space. But the other reason we got in the space is if you ask our churches that are most involved with ministry to immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, either in a focused way or as part of feeding ministries and language ministries, they will tell you that they have been doing it since before CBF was founded. Which means they've been doing it since before it was either cool or controversial. And the reason they're doing it is because Jesus said, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. And so they see it, their voices. The other pastors who provided statements in support of the lawsuit are all serving very purple, centrist CBF churches. And they spoke about this in the language of their own calling and their own concern for what it was doing to their ability to serve people they felt called to serve. Now, one of the incredible challenges of this moment is that because everything has become political. Like you haven't asked this question yet, but I was once asked the question, Paul, why is it that CBF wants to carry the water of the Democratic Party? That's what I meant this morning by demotion. I don't know why political affiliation is in this room, but that water doesn't interest me at all. CBF's work in this space is work that Christians, conservative and liberal, but I would say more conservative than liberal, have been involved in for the longest period of time. So I understand that we live in a moment where things are experienced politically, and I'm not denying there are political ramifications for this, but our motivations are around historic Baptist principles. And basically it comes down in the pleadings to the separation of church and state, which has always held that the state doesn't have a right to direct the life of a congregation unless there is a pressing public interest. And pressing public interest, we think, is satisfied by a warrant. But here again, I'm now in real trouble because I'm talking to a lawyer, as I remember from our first conversation. But I promise you I'd be really transparent about these things. I didn't promise everybody to agree, but I don't see it as politics. I don't deny that it is experienced as, but I see it as rooted in the mission and ministry of Jesus and the pleadings from some church leaders who are trying to do what they thought they were called to do.
Thank you, Kenny, for, anybody else to this issue. I've got one other thing that's come up a couple of times I want to speak to, and then I'm open to questions. Do you have a different question, Tommy, or you just want to speak to this?
Comment.
Please.
Tommy Stoddard.
Hey, Tommy.
I just wanted to, because it kind of relates to this, but it looks like, and I know it came up very early in this conversation about red, blue, and purple.
Yeah.
So it's there.
Yep.
So and you're saying we probably primarily purple.
Mm-hmm.
So as a purple organization, it looks like we don't support a lot of these little things, but we partner with groups that do seem to.
Mm-hmm.
And they're advertised, and we become associated with it. So I'd be interested to see how we make those decisions with groups that do have provocative stances on political issues.
So you've asked a really, really important question. And it gets to one of the things John, I think, was getting ready to ask. So I'm going to suggest you hold me accountable. I am not leaving this room till I answer your question. So I'm not asking John to ask his question to avoid yours. I want to answer yours in relation to his. Is that fair? All right, if we're good, then you go ahead, John.
I think this is exactly what Tommy is talking about without, saying it out, fully saying it out loud. One of the articles that some members brought to me was an affiliation with the Association of Welcoming and Affirming Baptists.
Yep.
AWAB.
Yeah.
And one of the things that, while I didn't read, I haven't read a ton of articles, I do know of who AWAB is. And I also have been a part of other organizations with CBF. I'm not trying to answer your question. I do want you to talk specifically about LGBTQI issues and CBF's kind of stance in that space, but also recognizing that as a long tenured youth minister who was at one time elected the president of the CBF Youth Ministry Network, which carries your moniker.
Yes, it does.
I wanted to make sure that anyone understood that CBF Global supported us so well, but did not give us one plug nickel.
Yep.
To do our work, we assessed one another, right? So we got together, and I know it's odd for youth ministers to be organized, but we were organized in a way that we self-assessed, and we said, we want to be a part of the organization, pay this fee.
Yep.
It helped us pull off, and other partner organizations that weren't CBF did. Of course, local, I'm not saying no state and regional organization did support us, because they did when we pulled off things like Oasis and some of those other things. But, and so as you all deal in spaces with organizations that some of us might be liberal, some of us might be conservative, what do those relationships look like, especially as it relates to some of the more liberal connective tissues that you all have, I guess, the publicity that you got this last year. Does that help, Tommy?
So I thought his question and yours were at least cousins. And so I wanted to make sure we got them all out, so everybody had all the background. So you're correct. that after what was called the Affirming Network of CBF merged in with the Association of Welcoming and Affirming Baptists, there was all kinds of media. And there was media coverage that said that CBF had merged with AWAB. That's false. The Affirming Network of CBF was a group of CBF-related churches who also defined themselves as being welcoming and affirming, who, because CBF as an entity as a whole is not welcoming and affirming, depending on your perspective, that's either good news or bad news, but it's just the news. They wanted to organize a space in CBF where that perspective could be discussed. The way I often explain this, and I don't know if this is true at First Baptist Greenwood, I hadn't been around you long enough to know with certainty, but I think it's possible, so bear with me. Every church I pastored had a Sunday school class that was more progressive than the rest of the church, or a Sunday school class that was notably more conservative than the rest of the church, and actually one of them had both. Anybody ever heard of that before? Without admitting whether it's happened here or not. Anybody ever heard of that before? Well, that exists in CBF. And so CBF's a Big Ten organization. We serve congregations of a wide range. And these networks John is talking about, like the Youth Ministry Network, like what the Affirming Network used to be, like a Children's Ministry Network, like a Mission Leaders Network, they spring up at the grassroots because people in the fellowship organize them. CBF Global gives budget support to none of them. CBF never gave any budget money to the Affirming Network for a number of reasons, but one of them was we knew that most of the congregations we worked for would not be ready to support that cause. And we don't take lightly that reality. The leaders of that network decided on their own to merge in with this organization called the Association of Welcoming and Affirming Baptists because it didn't make any sense to them for churches like that to be caught between two partners that were doing the same thing. But CBF gave no money First Baptist Greenwood gave unless you designated it, which I don't think happened, unless you designated it to that kind of cause ever went to that ministry, and it is not today. It is absolutely true, Tommy, that there are media interests that have a presence in the CBF world who are much more politically progressive. So another one that is often viewed that way is Baptist Youth Global. CBF Global gives Baptist Youth Global no budget money. If we're hiring staff and we want to advertise the position, sometimes we'll put a free ad in Baptist Youth Global about the position. Occasionally, something newsworthy happens and they want to cover it, and we don't hide from those kinds of questions. They have exposure in part, so, all the CBF world. What you need to know is none of our undesignated money goes to Baptist Youth Global. None. CBF was founded, you mentioned, in 1991 at a time when there was a great fear of top-down centralized power. How else do you think we had 12 seminaries and 15 state and regional organizations? Do you think are there business people in this room? Like, would anybody think that was a good idea from a business perspective? It happened that way because we were founded in a time when people were understandably distrusting of centralized authority. So all kinds of things sprung up. And CBF, sometimes I'm asked about seminaries. CBF has no ownership, no control, no seats on the boards of any seminaries. And for that reason, almost all the work we do right now with seminaries is focused on scholarships for students from CBF churches that choose to go to that seminary. Right now, we're trying to focus more and more of that money that goes to support students in seminary to serve in congregation, so we can at least make sure that our scholarship money is leading people to congregational leadership and not to other just academic study of religion. So where a phrase we have used in the last several years is we partner financially around shared priorities that are the benefit of the overwhelming majority of our congregations. So while there may be networks or groups or perspectives across CBF where there are some people who believe very strongly something that the rest of the movement doesn't believe, and we make space for that, just like you do in your church, that's not funded by the movement as a whole. So there's a space, but there's not control, there's not authorization, there's not blessing. For better and for worse right now, so CBF's budget last year was $15 million. Do you know how much money goes to partners in that $15 million? $225,000. So it's a large amount of money, but it's a really small percentage of CBF's budget. And one of the things we're thinking about actively right now is that even a space that we're trying to move away from long-standing, forever kind of partnerships and what we call initiative-based partnerships, where we do work together with organizations around a shared priority where we can advertise it and we don't get in these long-standing relationships where things change and then you're just stuck carrying the water, literally. Does that help any, or do you want to ask a follow-up question?
I'm sorry.
No, that's great.
I guess you would say that those things informally will come up and exist as organizations, but if we don't necessarily support financially, and it's not necessarily our main purview. So
Yeah.
sometimes I think we get those things that come to us and they surprise us, and we think, well, I didn't know I was supporting that, so I think sometimes it's good to have an explanation from the top about how that goes about. We appreciate it.
So, Tommy, what I can always promise you is if your church's lay leadership, your pastor, an email you send to my address actually comes to me. It doesn't go through a screening agent. And so, we want to be responsive to the questions from our congregations. We work for you. I can't promise you that every answer I ever give you you'll agree with because we're Baptists, but I can promise you I'll tell you the truth as I see it, and then you can weigh it. But one thing that's very much on my mind is that as a pastoral leader of this denomination that is very diverse in a time when not much is, I've got to make sure that our energies, our financial energies, our prayers, our staff energies are focused on the things that meet the needs of the greatest numbers of our congregations and reflect their values. So we don't kick out dissenters in CBF. So I do want to be real clear about that. So I'm often asked this question, well, if most CBFers are this way and there's this group real conservative over here or real liberal over here, why don't you ask them to go? And my answer, rightly or wrongly, is because Baptists don't vote out their dissenters. Baptists in our love for soul liberty and for conscience, we're the ones who are supposed to stick with one another in these kind of complicated, big tent spaces where we who don't see things the same way can still hear from each other and learn from each other and be challenged by each other. So, if you have a question about are we stewarding the resources that First Baptist Greenwood is choosing to invest in CBF in a way that reflects your values, you better ask. And if anybody who works for me refuses to answer the question, you better let me know.
I recognize you got a hard job.
Yeah, so do a lot of us right now, Tommy. So we got to be in it together. Are there other? We really want to make sure we hear from as many people today as who want to be heard and who need to be heard. So please.
First of all, thank you for being here. I've been here since 1990.
Wow.
And this is the first time I think that we've had open dialogue.
Well,
most of the time it's from the pulpit, which we appreciate. But thank you for doing that. The disappointment is such few people here.
Yeah.
My question, I want you and John, I guess, to both kind of answer it, because I don't understand, even though I've been here since 1990, exactly what we do and how and what our money goes to for CBF. I understand that there's basically a couple of line items. One is for the state association, and the other is for the big picture.
Yep.
And specifically, the reason I want to know is if I get the sense that a lot of our giving and our feel good for being a part of the association is for missions.
Mhm.
Yet if only around 36 to 37%
Mhm.
of what we give to the overall organization goes to missions,
Yeah.
we understand that. So
Yeah,
if
that's
I
a
can ask that basically in two parts, John, if you would explain where
Yep.
the two line items go, and then why can't more of our money go more than 36%?
Commissions. Yeah.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, David, but David and I talked about this, this week.
Mhm.
I think South Carolina, correct me if I'm wrong, South Carolina CBF and Global have a relationship like no other state organization.
It was the first of its sort, and if you know the name Marion Aldridge, who was the founding coordinator of CBF South Carolina, remarkable person. He and my first predecessor, Cecil Sherman, so they were two characters in the holiest kind, negotiated the deal that John's talking about. It's lasted that long.
Yeah, and so if a church were to give $100 in South Carolina, they give it to South Carolina City. In a normal state, right?
Yeah.
And then South Carolina CBF diverts a percentage of those dollars to Florida.
That's right.
Correct.
And the default percentage of that, unless a church says otherwise, is so every $100 First Baptist Greenwood gives to CBF, 55 cents goes to CBF Global, and 45 cents goes to CBF South Carolina. And that's been the percentage since.
And then of that 55 cents, only 36% makes it to mission. So
Yep.
the point is,
So you have
not
you.
a lot, not
So
a lot of what we're making is actually.
so now let me ask a question that'll help me. Does the church promote the offering for global missions?
It has in the past. It hasn't since I've been here, but it has promoted the offering for global missions.
So depending on, so the reason I asked that question in response to this really important question is that every dollar given to the offering for global missions goes to support the salaries and the benefits and the presence cost of CBF's global missions field personnel. So like churches that feel a really strong kinship toward just field personnel ministries alone put a lot of energy into promoting that offering. And so that tool exists. Now, CBF's regular budget includes everything else related to missions. So, like global missions doesn't have its own IT or HR or finance office. So some of the rest of the money that's not in the 37% that supports the HR, IT, finance and accounting, what we might call in the business world platform services that allows us to send those missionaries, as well as our other global mission staff who are not field personnel, as well as the member care program that cares for them, are all funded by the 55 cents that comes. There's nothing stopping any church. So here, something else about being Baptist, and gosh, this is messy, but I studied with Methodists at Duke and I still came out wanting to be Baptist. That's another conversation for another time. But part of the messiness of it is a church in its autonomy can designate its gifts to us however they feel led, because your conscience matters. And so if you were to say, first of all, we want CBF Global to spend more of the money that comes from First Baptist Greenwood on global missions, but you have two ways you can do that. You could either actively promote the offering for global missions, or you could take some money in your budget and designate it to the offering for global missions. And if you want to talk through that in more detail, I'm happy to get on a virtual call with anybody who wants to have that conversation. The relationship's that important. But I'd also ask you to be mindful that some of that 37%, the 37% doesn't include the administrative hardware for global missions. And it also doesn't include the work being done to help congregations discern their own mission engagement in their communities, or the other kinds of things I was talking about around supporting new ministers. So think about how Cecil Sherman and Marion Aldridge used to say there are only two reasons that Baptists and all their diversity cooperate for a long period of time. One of them is the global mission, and one of them is next generation of pastoral leaders.
Right. I'm proud of First Baptist Greenwood's investment.
Yep.
Outside of that 37%, because I was trained in a CBF affiliated seminary.
Mhm.
And I have gone through peer groups who have given me language around theology and understanding a deep relationship that has connected me and wanted me to continue to be a part of churches who saw themselves in that relationship. Right? And so, and so that those investments, and you know, as a businessman, you understand what those return on investments are and how even in our space, and then one of the things that we're going to learn about ourselves as a church is the fact that part of our annual budget, a percentage of our annual budget is too large related to facilities. Imagine that. In a building that's built with stone and wood and plaster and not cheaper material. Every space is trying to wrestle over perfect percentages, and I think in these conversations, I think Jim brings a good point up. All I want us to do is intentionally partner. Right, and decide as a group who we want to support. Because it may be that this conversation, frankly, births relationship between individual members of our church and some of the groups that CBF partners with, both on the right and the left. Because they didn't know you could get the revenue to support these other issues. But what we're going to do, as he's already said, what we're going to do is we're going to walk through this wilderness together.
Yeah.
And we're going to continue to understand, to answer the question that I keep bringing up, which is how much of God do we think we understand?
Yeah.
And if I cannot understand the totality of God, but I have wise partners for the journey that know a slice of who God is, when we get around the table in fellowship, when we sit in a room like this, we learn from one another. Because God is continuing to shape Lawrence, Carol, Andrew, Carol, and me. And we're continuing to be called to the task of not, all right, what are the things that we can figure out about CBF that would help us leave? But what are the things that CBF is choosing to do, and other organizations, frankly, because we don't just need CBF.
Nope.
I love Paul. I love CBF, but we don't just need CBF. We need Pathway House.
Yeah.
We need Greater Greenwood United Ministry. And we need them more. Because they serve people that live in our county. And we are going to continue to ask ourselves as a Baptist group, who are our partners? Who do we want to invest in a real way? And how can we continue to bring the love of Christ to those who either do not know Him or have yet to experience that kind of love, even though they've heard about who this Nazarene is, but see it really reflected in the way we show up for it. That's where I want us to be.
Sure.
And we are, it's 2:00. Yes, Henderson, Nancy?
By all means.
How do we know who those partners are? How do we know who those CBF partners are? I feel it's my own fault in the dark.
Sure.
Because if you think about where CBF was when we became a part of them in 94, to the back to the land, to where CBF is today, that was a moderate group of people that are not moderate anymore.
Well, I argue that they are. There are spots of them who've made the headlines that he's described who are liberal. But on the whole, those many of those partners are moderate partners.
Yep.
Are not privy to the details of CBF and where that money does go.
Sure.
What we are
Supporting, right.
but in the community, we are identified with what people think CBF is and what we've been led to believe. And I don't think we really know what CBF is.
So I think, Nancy, I thank you because you've named a really important thing that actually, in different ways, we all contend with. So there's the reality of what CBF is, and then there's the reality of how people and varieties of present CBF. And so that's why conversations like the one we're starting today are really, 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 really important. So I don't have any reservation or hesitation about talking really specifically about where CBF money goes. I'll also say this. If there is a kind of cause that you think it's important for you to support personally, or if this congregation thinks it wants to support, and there's a partner you may not be in relationship with yet, if I know who they are, I will encourage you to explore them because that's actually part of my job. So one of the reasons I'm committed to doing conversations like this is I don't believe that denominational questions have to be divisive for churches. Too often they are for a lot of reasons. And that doesn't mean I think that any of us will always agree. That's not my point. But I have no reason to hide or be dishonest about anything CBF is spending money on. But if there's things you're called to do that are not being done through CBF, then I would want to help you find ways to do that too. Because I want this church to thrive. And John mentioned something really important here. Like churches, like something else true about a lot of historic CBF churches is you're doing ministry in this community with local partners. It's really, really important. And about 15, 20 years ago, CBF started doing something that has created both opportunity and challenge. We started resourcing congregations around how to expand their impact in their own community. It's called the Missional Church Initiative. You might remember the It's Time books that Daniel Vestal and Bo Prosser wrote. Churches were given many grants to establish programs in their own communities. More and more church resources went to those kinds of partners who John's talking about that in the old days would have come to the denomination. Our business savvy was real good, Jim. We started that right as the Great Recession was at its height. And so we helped churches take money that historically would have come to the denomination and invest it in local communities. That's either genius or crazy or a little bit of both, right? But it does reflect our conviction that was true in 1991, Nancy, and is true today. Congregations are really important. And we think you have a witness in Greenwood that nobody else can have. And we do want to see you live it out. I think one thing I just want to make sure I say, we're talking a lot about purple. And we're talking a lot about diversity. And in the room, everybody doesn't think the same way. And I was in another purple church a couple weeks ago, and I said this there. I'm going to say it here, and you can decide whether this is helpful or not. You're not paying any extra for this. A lot of times talk about purple as though it's a liability we have to manage. I want to encourage you to think of it as an opportunity for a witness. Because where else in this broken world right now do people who do not think the same way have the capacity to have a respectful conversation? Where else is the possibility of encountering a love that does not require agreement? What is First Baptist Greenwood uniquely equipped to show the world about the kind of community the risen Jesus can engineer? Precisely because you don't all agree on everything. Like, thank God the gospel is not, God so loved the world that he saved those who understood it perfectly or completely agreed. You don't need God for that. Facebook can take care of that. But you need a power that raises the dead to engineer a life of a community that doesn't all see it the same way. And that's why I've spent my life in these kinds of congregations, because the opportunities is much higher than in an echo chamber on the far right or the far left. That I actually think most days that's pretty boring.
And I do think, to Nancy's point, I do think much like every organization nationally, locally, this church has grown and changed over the years. I think CBF has grown and changed over the years. I do think that Paul's already kind of spoken to the fact that 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 our friends who have used the word woke about us, or CBF, or liberal, or whatever the word is of the day that tries to divide us. They're only reading part of the articles, right? The ones that are out there and have he's already spoken to. But some of the stories about Janae Angel and about Rick and Ellen Burnett and about the other couple that I worked at, Rick and Ellen Burnett in Thailand when I was at Mac. And these other stories of congregations who are serving in their communities, we are hearing those stories. And I said this on a Wednesday night, and I want to say it again. You know, I want us to be a light in Greenwood for the gospel. And I also want us to be seen as uh, both as a cooperative agent, but also a challenging, a cataclysmic agent. I want us to challenge one another, but I also want us to challenge other churches.
Mm-hmm.
But over and above everything else is what this preacher preached about an hour or 2 hours ago. And that is, we don't have anything to win.
Mm-hmm. It's already won.
God has already won. God's looking for partners. He wants us to partner. But when we try, we're picking the wrong battles. Now, we've got to understand where God's at work.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a difficult job, but it's our job to do it together, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's our job to do it together. Henderson, did you have your question answered?
I didn't grow up in a CBF church. I mean, we all have our perception of what CBF is.
Yeah.
But I feel, we say you had $15 million in the budget. Where's that $15 million go? You have a list of partnerships.
Only.
Can you say we get our money?
Yeah.
Go to this group, or our specific church money may not go to this group. We may not disagree, or we may not agree with. But by us being a part of this church and supporting CBF, our money is still supporting this group. And I don't know, we're whole thing about missions and all that. You say, hey, we support the local missions. What's enough to just support our local missions? Give the money to CBF. Why don't we just give that money to our local area?
So the overwhelming majority of CBS's $15 million either goes to support the offering for global missions receipts are part of the 15 million. So every year we take in about 20% of that budget is the offering for global missions. That's the salaries and benefits of field personnel. If the church actually doesn't support the offering for global missions, then you're not represented in that 3 million. If other parts of that $15 million is annual grants CBF receives from grant makers that support leadership education for churches. So in CBF, you benefit from access to those programs, but your undesignated contributions don't support those grant-funded programs either. So that $15 million budget is both restricted and unrestricted income, field personnel salaries income, other unrestricted income. So $15 million is not what's contributed by churches, including this church. Our undesignated receipts overwhelmingly pay for the infrastructure that supports the sending of missionaries and for the projects that allow us to do things like the financial health assessment and financial strain work in congregations that I described earlier and other things like that. So of that money, only $200,000, $225,000 goes to support partners of any kind. There's about $200,000 for scholarships that supports seminary students, theological education projects, things like that. But it's overwhelmingly that kind of support infrastructure.
And we can get a list of the.
And we can get a list of all that.
partnerships.
You can get a list of all that. You can get all that.
All right. So I've heard we want clarity around all of those partnerships. Yes, Alice?
As I look around this room, some of us are new to CBF.
Yes.
Some of us are even new to this church.
Wonderful.
Short, sweet definition of purple church and tent, big tent church.
So I'll give you my definition, and John probably has his own. So Cooperative Baptist Fellowship is cooperative in lots of ways. So in most churches I go to, about half the folks there didn't grow up Baptist, much less CBF. So you got Methodists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Lutherans, and several kinds of Baptists under one roof. So those churches are in and of themselves denominationally purple. That is, they didn't all come up from in a Baptist mindset. And thank God, everywhere I go, I meet people who haven't been in CBF from the very beginning, who have come to be a different kind of Baptist in a church like First Baptist Greenwood. Purple for me means not just denominationally diverse, it also means politically diverse. So people who vote blue and red or red and blue in the same worship space, in the same Sunday school classes sometimes, at the same Wednesday night table. One of the things about being a pastor of a church is you usually know how people vote, and it's not because you ask, it's what they tell you. And like after the 2016 election, which was the last election I was a pastor, like 3 weeks later, we were celebrating communion. And I looked over to a row and I said, oh my gosh. There was a row of 5 people passing the elements to each other, and they all voted differently. And they all had a different attitude about it. And 3 of them were deacons. Now you think that's just normal? There are other denominations that are purple. But in the United Methodist Church, even before their latest schism, you had blue churches and you had red churches making up a purple denomination. Here's the truth about CBF and the Methodist split. I know a number of CBF churches in towns where people who left the Methodist Church for both reasons are visiting the CBF church. Talk about an interesting conversation at Rotary with the Methodist pastors. So you have a political and religious diversity. We talked earlier about CBF and immigration. Some of the volunteers in the ministries with immigrants and refugees, well, they voted both ways in the last election. I know that because they told me to. So it's not it's a really unusual thing in this world, which is an echo chamber world, for people who don't read the same, don't get their news from the same places, don't vote the same way, come together. However, this is not original to the church. Have you read 1 Corinthians 13? Do you know why 1 Corinthians 13 was written? It was not written for weddings. I think I've been here 4 hours today. I've been here long enough to tell you the truth about that too. It was not written for weddings. It was written to provide a framework by which people who grew up reading different philosophers and grew up Greek and Jewish could worship together in the same church. And when it's heard that way, it is a primer in Christian life in this kind of moment. Oh my gosh. Check this out, y'all. You ready? You think 11 was hard? Love is patient and kind. Love is not arrogant or boastful. It does not insist on its own way. Love bears all things. Believes all things. Hopes all things. endures all things, love never ends. As for prophecy, which includes sermons, including this morning, thank God, they will come to an end. But faith, hope, and love, these three abide in the greatest love. It is a mandate for Christian living in the space of difference. But that's the challenging opportunity of this purple. That is Big Tent. It's true in most CBF churches I visit. It's true every time the CBF denomination gathers. You got very conservative traditionalists. You've got very progressive folks. You've got a whole bunch of people in the middle. The majority of CBF life is still actually some shade of moderate. And gosh, it's an adventure.
And I think to that question, it's it's where I started that June with that backpack that I kept carrying in every week was one of those first sermons about we are going to find unity. We're going to seek unity in Christ under this big tent. But we can't find uniformity. I can't find uniformity at 126 Amherst Drive.
Sounds like you're not alone based on other testimonies I've heard today.
And so, I think our task is to understand who our partners are, to discern what we value most as a group of believers, as a church, and then do everything we can to protect those values and to ferociously support partners who hold those same values. Right? That's our work.
Mm-hmm.
That's our work.
Yeah.
Any other comments or questions? Look, we didn't have turkey and dressing, but it was about as much like a family dinner at Thanksgiving as you can ever get.
We may have been more
We
specific.
are family, chosen family. Right? We choose to show up. And it does not go, it's not lost on me that you get up early on a day, you sleep in, especially when it's raining, and you drive across town or around the corner, or some of you walk from the neighborhood, and you show up for worship and Bible study. And I'm grateful for that. And I'm also grateful for the fact that we are all in the wilderness right now. Okay, we are in the wilderness. There's people argue there's never been a time like this in American history. I'm reading a book about the Donner Party. It's not rosy. It's not a rosy picture, but one of the chapters described the American kind of the move that the president was making at the time. And there's always unrest, right? There's always division. But we gather here at the corner of Grace, 722 Grace Street, at the corner of Grace in the World, and we've got to figure out how we can live as family. And that's one of the reasons I've wanted us to have this conversation, for Paul to come and answer all your questions. I really am grateful for your time.
Thank you, John.
For your candor, and for the relationship. And then we've got continued conversations and work to do as a faith family, to figure out where God is leading us in partnership with others. The opinions that matter most are right here in this room. They're right here. There are other opinions in town, certainly. Many of them might not have ever worshiped with us before, and they don't really know you. They don't really know us. Let's hold all those perspectives in balance. I don't want to hide from any conversation, and I'm ready to have them all. But we're going to walk forward through this wilderness together, because the King of Kings, who stood up under the trials in the wilderness, will lead us.
Yep.
No one else. At least as long as y'all have me as pastor. That's going to be my word, right? We're going to seek Jesus, and we're going to take up our cross and follow him in every way we can. Thank you for being here. I'm really grateful. And for you, Paul.
Thank you all so much.
Very much.
Great to be here today.
All right, y'all go home.